Hello, and welcome to today's episode of Rawkode Live. I am Rawkode, your host, and today we're going to be taking a look at behavior-driven development, example mapping, and a little bit of Gherkin potentially. To do that today, I have a friend of mine who is my go-to in all of these topics, Kieran McNulty. Hey mate, how are you?
Very kind. I'm good, thanks.
Good. Yeah, you are my go-to. I think I definitely send you far too many messages going, help me, please. I have no idea what I'm doing. So I'm glad that we can do this in a way that we can share some of that knowledge with other people, and hopefully using a project that is something I'm actually really working on, so we can show them how this applies to like a real domain and hopefully break it down a little bit.
Yeah, great. I'm sure I send you an equal amount of Docker and Linux questions.
Yeah. Maybe our friendship's a little bit too transactional. So, like, we should probably start then, I guess. I mean, am I right in saying that we're going to use example mapping to understand what I'm trying to build with a little bit? Does that immediately go to Gherkin and scenarios? How did all these bits go together? And in fact, back up. What's behavior-driven development? If you got like a 30-second pitch?
Sure. BDD is one of the characteristic things about the BDD community is that it isn't really strictly defined. Kind of a bit like DDD in that way, in that there's lots of different ways of doing things. What they have in common is a kind of approach, a set of practices to be used in agile type environments that encourage fast feedback loops. And BDD emphasizes, Liz Keogh's definition is good. BDD emphasizes talking about behavior using examples. And that leads to many things. It comes from the TDD tradition, where you write a test first. That's the kind of genesis of BDD. Dan North was trying to teach people to do this. And there's a kind of stumbling block when you tell people to write tests first, isn't there? Because it doesn't make sense. Right, when you go to school, you have the test at the end. You learn, you do the thing, and then you get tested. So Dan, who I think was into things like NLP and that kind of stuff, decided to not use the word test and instead describe the behavior first and then implement it. So in BDD terms, you sort of think about those things as specifications or, descriptions of what the system's going to do, and then you implement it. And then you somehow automate a test against that description. So it's the same TDD cycle, but you're sort of thinking about it a bit different. And that was, 20 years ago. No, 12 years ago.
So, yeah, I'm not sure if I like this. You want me to know what I'm writing before I write it? I mean, that sounds blasphemous. Like,
you need to think about the thing.
But no, what I mean is like maybe it's just me and being an absolute cowboy of a developer, but generally I just hack at the code until I think it does what I want it to do, and then trying to look back at it. And I know that's a wrong approach, and I've tried to get into TDD many times.
Right.
While I appreciate the design improvements my code has when I do TDD, there's still a wall you have to get over to really ingrain that approach on you. And I don't feel that I'm there yet, but I am getting better.
No, that's very, very true. And there's certainly a good argument that a TDD approach isn't a good fit for all problems. If I've got absolutely no idea how I'm going to do something, it's hard for me to write tests. So another element of Dan North's BDD definition is that it's sort of multi-level. I can't remember the exact phrasing, but it can be applied at different levels. So it may be, just to give an example, it might be I'm going to write a script that's going to recognize images of faces in photos. And imagine I'm the first person who's ever thought of that. You can't just rent time to do that on some cloud service. What test can I write? If I don't know how I'm going to do that yet, if it's a sort of R&D thing, I can't write a test easily at a low level. I can write a test at a higher level, which is, if you get all these photos, you'll know who's in them. But a lot of the work I'm doing underneath that level won't be driven by TDD. Right. Just because I'm just hacking stuff together. So I find that a lot in those very sort of unknown areas, I don't do TDD particularly. I'll hack something together. If that's good enough, I won't worry about things. But if that's something quite important, once I've hacked it together and I've kind of got a mental model of it, I maybe will write a clean version that I do TDD, because I kind of know what the bits are going to be and how they'll fit together.
Oh yeah, definitely.
So something that BDD has grown to talk about a lot is acceptance testing. So when I'm talking to someone at business level, or maybe I and the team, we're having to talk about what we're going to build this sprint, build next. You can apply a BDD approach where you think, what's it going to look like when it's finished? That kind of feature level acceptance test or acceptance criteria setting. That's a nice level to talk about, because you can have that conversation at a level that the business is actually involved in. So it helps bridge some of that communication gap. Before we build it, can we talk about what we're going to build? Isn't that controversial a conversation topic? And you can do it in a way where the technical people will then figure out the technical implementations after. So you can have a sort of like business level conversation, and that's tends to be where people use BDD practices like the ones we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, and in fact, when we were talking about potentially doing this session, one of the things we said was, so the thing I'm trying to build, I want to be open source, and I want to be able to tell people what it does, and then a way that kind of reveals the details of how it works. But I didn't really know that myself either, and what we decided was that this process would be a way for me to kind of submit my own knowledge, what I wanted to do and how it works, and then share that with other people, and we kind of get benefits without even necessarily going straight into the testing aspect of it. Just that language and the examples tell people, hey, this is what it does, this is how it works, and it might fit your use case. So.
Yeah, and I work with different teams trying to do this, and I think the situation you're in is something similar to a lot of teams I work with, where they've started with the testing, right?
Yeah.
And then, why? Maybe some of the people in the audience don't know how Gherkin looks, but one of the sets of tools that people use for BDD is Cucumber. Others are available, and one of the things you do is you write down the steps of each test in English. Other languages are available. And why bother? It's because that's then going to get used for something. But if you're starting with the tests and then you're going back and sort of saying, well, how will you think of the test and you say, how am I going to write that in English? It's kind of backwards, and it's harder. It's much harder to do. So the reason I suggested example mapping, which I often do with these teams, is like, let's do it top down. Let's start with your understanding of what it's going to do, and then drive out examples.
Yep.
And then some of them will be acceptance tests. Because otherwise you're sort of imagining what the conversation we had before would have sounded like if we'd had it.
All right. So should we, well, first we'll do a couple of the comments. So Mark Taylor, looking forward to this. Yep, me too. Glad you are. And common friend of ours, James. Hey man, how's it going? Also, because I've been on PTO time off for a week, I've forgotten how to stream and actually do my job. So what I'll also say is I want to say thank you to Equinix Metal. I'll put a code on the bottom of the screen there. If you want to check out Equinix Metal, there's a $50 coupon. Fill your boots. Right. So the domain that we're working on today, let me set a little bit of background on this. I do a lot of GitOps. And if you're not familiar with the term GitOps, let me try and give you the 30-second version of that too. GitOps is a method of continuous delivery where we declare in a declarative fashion what we want to be running in our production environment through manifests. Like I do a lot of Kubernetes, so generally it's YAML manifests. Controller lives inside of the Kubernetes cluster and continually pulls that Git repository and applies it into the cluster so that no matter if manual changes happen to the cluster, they get blown away very, very quickly. That's the very quick version of what GitOps is trying to do. Now, I started applying this to more models now that aren't just Kubernetes. And one of the things that I built internally in our team at Equinix Metal is like a static site generator that pulls from YAML, parses it, renders a site. And I want that to be continuous as well. Like whenever someone pushes a change to the YAML documents inside the Git repository, I actually want it to serve that over an API. GraphQL is a database. Yeah, I can see that weird look in your face, but it's actually a really nice approach. In fact, it's strange that James is on this because he's written a YAML database before, and this is not actually too different, except Git is the database, and I'm just continually updating my models and memory and delivering it over an API. But it means I can have a almost static or purely front-end generated site that knows all those YAML documents via the API. The why I can definitely cover more later, maybe as examples on future episodes. But for today, what I wanted to so what I started doing a month ago was extracting that Git logic to a library so that other people can build in Rust their own GitOps-like operations. So the library we're using today is here. I've not touched it in a month. A month is when I reached out to you, going, help. I have no idea what I'm doing when it comes to BDD. So I decided to keep this mostly for today's episode. So it's called GitSync. It's on gitlab.com/rawkode/gitsync. Right now, it's very, very trivial, and it really just clones a repository. And that's where that starts to get a little bit complicated, which is why I reached out to you, because there are a whole bunch of rules and semantics that I really need to declare first, and I wanted to do that viewing with feature files so that I don't make a mess of it. Because what happens if I run this program, it clones a repository, it runs in a loop, pulling all the changes, and someone makes a manual change? Do I reset the repository and then fetch again? Do I throw an error? What if there's a force write on the remote and I can no longer pull changes? What's the procedure to rectify? And there's a whole bunch of these. I mean, we all work with Git. We know it's painful when something unexpected happens. Yeah. And I need to be able to codify that now in these feature files so that when other people want to use this library, they can go, what happens if someone force rewrites to the remote and then it's out of sync? Like, what are the rules? And I want us to use example mapping to try and document that. Does that make sense?
Do you have any tests at the moment?
Yes, there are. So in Rust, I have check that it can clone if there's nothing there, which is the simplest test I could get. And then, oh wait, that's the cloner repository. Oh yeah, and this one is a check to see if a clone exists, but I don't have any tests that confirm the logic of what happens when it does exist and it tries to clone. So it can check the check that there's a Git repository where I want it to be, and I can check that it can clone if it doesn't. Okay. I then did start to write a feature file here. And got really, really lost. You can see my 6 lines of gherkin before my brain exploded. And it was really just trying to take that test I'd already written and write in a feature file, which you've just told me, yeah, don't do that. So
you can. I mean, if the use case you've got, which is you're hoping people are going to read it in the future, is a good reason to do it.
Right. Okay.
So retrofitting in that way, I'm not 100% against it. It's just harder. It's just acknowledge it's harder. What's hard to do is, if you don't know who the intended audience is, I think something you maybe struggle with is just looking at it. It's hard to know what level of detail to go into. So when you're talking to real people involved in the project, a mixture of business people, test people, dev people, you'll talk about the project, especially if you're having a quick conversation. You'll talk about a project at a level of abstraction that the business people care about. What I mean is there'll be a depth where they care how it works. Like, it's really important that this thing happens. It's really important that this thing happens. And everything under it, they don't care about. And that's really different for different groups of people.
Yeah.
What happens in like dysfunctional waterfall-y type situations is that you spend ages getting the business people to agree to all the detail and writing it all down, and there's a load of stuff they really don't care about. So some teams, it may be like, I need to be able to do this action somehow, and I don't care where in the system I do it. I don't care what the steps are. Like, I just need that capability, and if I've got that, after you've built the feature, if I've got that, it's a tick, let's go. Other people may really care it's in the specific sequence of steps. There may be really important business constraints to put in there. So what I'm getting at is that the real conversation naturally finds that level, and capturing that in the scenarios is a nice way of doing it.
Yeah, I think that depth is one of the things I've definitely struggled with. I mean, I've tried to adopt BDD multiple times over the years. In fact, I think the first time we met was when you were doing BDD training at a company I worked for, going back to it's like 5-6 years now. So
maybe more.
Yeah, maybe more. And maybe it's just my perception of the BDD community, or maybe it's the journey I've taken is just not normal. But I've seen examples where people say, "Oh, it should be high level because it shouldn't get into the implementation details." And then I've seen examples where they actually do kind of get into the implementation details. Like the depth seems to change, and now we're back up in another, what I see is a different version of BDD where it's okay, you shouldn't cover implementation details, but we do have examples which are inputs and outputs. Or I mean, it's all very blurry for me. It's not something I have a good understanding of.
So let's talk a little bit about example mapping. So Cucumber's been around for ages. Cucumber is what that Gherkin syntax comes from. Matt Wynne wrote about example mapping maybe 5 or 6 years ago, and it's so the way Matt talked about it, they've been using different workshop formats to try and come up with these scenarios and like make it less about typing stuff into an IDE, more about talking about it first. And there's still lots of ways of doing it, but example mapping is the one that kind of clicked for him. Yep. And he blogged about it, and I started using it, and it's a good starting point. It's a really great starting point of how are we going to have these conversations in our organization, in our team. You can tweak the format, for what works for you.
Yeah.
But we can sort of do a sort of vanilla example mapping and see how it goes. If you show the Miro, I can sort of explain what the components are.
Oh, you shouldn't have said Miro. You've ruined my joke. I was going to tell you to get your whiteboard out.
I do have loads of stickies.
You got loads. Of course you do. Of course you've got stickies.
Well, because I'm a consultant, I went big on buying loads of stationery, and then I've been sitting in my house for the last. So this is just a generic whiteboard, but let's talk about what the primitives are. So you're in a different part of the board to me.
I am.
I'll meet you in the middle. Hang on.
Oh, there we are. Right. Cool.
I'll zoom out a little bit. So we have example mapping. Who's in it? People who can make decisions about business stuff. So like a product owner type, BAs. People who are going to build it because it's important they understand it. And if you're not in the conversation and you just have the notes from the conversation afterwards, you don't have as much like implicit background knowledge.
So is this the Three Amigos thing, or is this different?
Yeah, and the people who are going to test it.
All right, okay.
And the point is to early on align the expectations of all of those people about what it's going to do. So it's called a feature, right? So let's do the format first. So you put a sticky on the wall and you say, right, this is the feature we're talking about.
Yep.
Just to give it some sort of scope. Sometimes people talk about multiple features at the same time. I've found this kind of conversation, it's best to just do it in 20 minutes and talk about one thing, and do that more often, rather than your afternoon of death when we just stay in the meeting room the whole time. So it's nice to do a quick, 20 to 30 minutes. And then you're going to say a feature is going to give someone the ability to do something. It's going to make some sort of change, right? So there are going to be rules. So we're going to try and capture what the rules are. And just by giving an example is a good idea. So a rule is something like, I've overused this example, but a rule is something like clothing is charged 20% VAT.
Okay.
Actually, maybe that's not a rule of the system. Maybe it's items get charged at the rate for the category of product they're in, to make it more future-proof when the VAT rate changes, right? So the rules are really the things that are going to actually be implemented in the system somewhere in code.
Okay.
But in general, each rule is either going to be implemented in code, specifically in the software, or is going to be implemented offline through some sort of policy.
Okay, so should we try and map my domain to the first feature and the first rule, or no?
Let's just talk about the other two things. So the good thing about features, the good thing about rules is that's the thing we really want to understand. What are the rules of the system? What algorithms are the programs going to have to implement? But then to make sure we understand them, I've done the wrong color. We give examples. And when you're in example mapping, you're not going to write out a big old paragraph, but you're going to give an example of how that rule would be applied. And you'd think for most rules, you'd need at least one example being applied in real life. And we scope the examples to the rule. Some would need more than one example. I'm sure you can think of a rule, You get one that I've used in talks is if you get free shipping if you buy more than the free shipping threshold, you need an example where the free shipping threshold is 50 quid and I spend 60 quid, so I don't pay any shipping. And I need another example where I go less. So how do you decide how many examples to give? We're not worried about testing yet.
Okay.
We're thinking if I was talking to David about this, how many examples would I have to give him with details in before he goes, okay, I get it. I understand.
A lot.
Yeah. But ideally, I'd hear some examples coming back from you.
Okay.
And then I go, yeah, that's how it works. So because the rules are so nebulous, they have lots of possible inputs, lots of possible outputs. It's really hard for us to tell if we've both understood the rule. If you've got an example that's got concrete detail in, we both run it through our heads. We both run it through our understandings of the rule. And if we both say, yes, that's how it should work, then it kind of tells us we've got that synchronization. Yeah.
Yep. Okay.
And the other thing that's important, especially in a big group, is we also capture questions. So even with the two of us, this is more applicable in a big group, but often you'll have a question and then you'll think, I'll ask about that in a minute, and then you forget. So it's good to be in the practice of writing down your question, especially when people start doing it. I like them to only be able to ask questions that they've written down, which is a bit of a training wheels thing, but it gets you into the practice, because if there's 5 of us and 3 people are talking, the other 2 can be writing down the questions that are coming up, and buffering them up for later. So that's it. So let's talk about your feature. What's your feature? Or you can start with the rules if you want.
No. So I want to, because
the feature's
when we say what is a feature, right? I mean, I can tell you the feature of the whole as an application as a whole, right, is to continuously fetch and update a Git repository locally, publishing changes as they happen. Now that's quite large, so I'm assuming the feature level has to be a little bit deeper than that. So I'm thinking, okay, does that mean that our first feature is it can clone a Git repository? Is that the first feature, or is that too low? I have no idea.
So actually, something that comes out of maybe I'll phrase it like cloning a Git repo. Now, feature really is just a way for us to bunch these things together. And the more I've done example mapping, the more I've started to think of features as a sort of logical grouping of business rules that all need to be implemented together for business reasons.
Okay. So
that a chunk of work. So it's related to that user story thing, right? The feature is the thing you might have in your sprint backlog or on your Kanban board. It's like, we'll do these bits together.
Okay.
And optimize that for as small as possible is a good practice.
So cloning a Git repository is a feature in this example mapping context, right?
Yeah, if it's something you would want to do on its own.
Yeah, it is how I started writing the code. The first bit of code I wrote was, I want this to be able to clone a repository. There are a couple of rules, which I'll try and guess now then. So the first rule is, if the directory already exists, don't clone it.
Okay, so we need to sort of figure out what level we're talking at. So is that like if it's already been cloned?
Okay, so there are a few different semantics here, I guess, right? So, I mean, we could go through the code maybe, or I can just try and remember it. But what happens is when we say, okay, start git sync, the first thing it does is says, okay, am I configured to pull a repository? Let's assume that is yes for now, because I don't think that's particularly interesting. It then says, okay, does the directory that I want to clone this to exist? If it does exist, it then checks that it's a Git repository. It checks that the remote matches what we are expecting the remote to be. So it will validate that the repository cloned is a Git repository and is the Git repository that we want to clone. So those are the two checks that happen.
All right, so there's an example where directory my project exists but isn't a Git repo.
Correct.
What happens?
It actually will print an error and exit.
Is Git sync something you run periodically?
So you would embed Git sync into your own application, which would run every 5 seconds and try to fetch updates for that repository. This is a startup rule, though. So if that directory already exists on startup and isn't a Git repository, then it just won't start the reconciliation loop.
What happens if it is a Git repository?
It will then inspect the remotes and check for one called origin, which matches the configuration. So it's basically saying, is this a repository I am supposed to be monitoring?
So you won't clone it?
No, if that check passes, it will enter the reconciliation loop. If it doesn't pass, it will exit with an error.
So,
are you regretting your decision to join me on this stream now?
No, it always feels like this in a new, because I'm having to level up, but I'm just helps me to just focus on typing things in and just type in what I'm listening to until I start to understand it. So I'm going to ask some questions. So, but enter reconciliation.
Yeah, reconciliation loop, I think, is another feature, but I'm unsure. We actually have a comment from Bradley who says, so is the feature just git sync and not cloning a repository? I don't know. I'll rely on Kieran.
So I would say that of all these things we're talking about, the feature is the thing that's most sort of arbitrary.
So does that mean the feature is first clone or git repository, and then we enter the second feature, which is the reconciliation loop? Would that be two different features with two different sets of rules?
I would say don't worry about it.
Okay.
A feature is just a way of bundling some rules together that we're going to talk about as one thing. And ideally, it's a bundle of rules that, I mean, if you want to go down that route, it's nice to have a feature that adds a capability. So it allows some entity to do something they couldn't do before, or stops them doing something bad that they could do before.
Okay. Oh, can I throw some questions at you then?
Yeah.
So, assuming other people are watching this because they want to be able to do their own example mapping, right? I'm assuming they're going to have some of the same questions that I've got. Now, the one that's sitting at the top of my head is, should I bog myself down with what the features are? Or could I just keep listing examples and then kind of segment them later? Is that another approach for doing this?
You should. So that's a really good question. Sometimes it's hard to... There's two types of people. Some people will come in, if you put a business person on the spot and say, right, you have to write the requirements for this IT project. Don't do that. But that's what most people do, right? They say, you have to submit a thing to this person by Tuesday to get it on the sprint, and all that kind of nonsense. Some of them will think through very clearly what are the rules. And often that's in a domain that's very rule-oriented, like maybe accounting or law. So they'll be able to write down things like, if it's something that's really familiar to them, they'll be able to write down, you can't issue a credit note without it being attached to an invoice that hasn't previously been credit note, something like that.
Yeah.
When you're reading those, but then put it in a load of paragraphs in Jira or something. But when you're reading that, you can sort of pull out the rules. And all you need to do then is make sure you understand the rules by giving examples of how that. You then generate some examples, and you're just checking that you've understood the rules that you spotted. The other way round is maybe it's in a quite complicated situation, or there's someone who doesn't have a huge knowledge of the domain, either because it's new or they're new to it. They might say, I don't know what the rules are, but if you ask a specific question, what should happen in this situation, they'll be able to tell you, which is like the examples first way. So we certainly can. There's only two of us, so the conversation isn't as busy, but quite often, if you hear an example, just write it down and don't allocate it to anything. And then later on, we'll figure out maybe that example has told us about some new rules,
All right, okay.
But the end state is we want the examples to be scoped to rules. So sometimes you'll have an example and you'll realize there's 5 or 6 rules being applied, and you'll have to kind of decompose it a bit to make it clearer. You'll have an example that's like the story of the entire system.
Yep. And
you'll kind of want to split it up a bit. So let's go back to what we're doing.
Yep.
I'm going to delete that question. If the repository was already cloned, don't clone it. So that makes sense. The directory exists, but isn't a Git repo. Show an error because you can't recover from that.
Yep.
If it exists and it is a Git repo, we'll do this thing called reconciliation next.
Well, yeah, we've missed. So we also had directory is a Git repo. It's not the correct Git repository.
Okay.
So that should error. Right? But it could be a Git repository, but when we analyze the remotes, we're like, oh, this is actually some other Git repository, at which point we can't do anything.
And what's the rule about whether it's the right reconciliation, whether it's the right one? It has a remote.
So if we imagine that when I'm going to add I'll add my own color. So, I mean, if we imagine that the way I start this would be repo let's just say github.com/rawkode/rawkode, right? And that's going to clone to a directory called my clone. Now, if my clone has a remote that isn't github.com/rawkode/rawkode, then I just have to error and exit.
Doesn't have a remote.
Well, I'll have a remote, but not the remote we expect.
So if it has a remote with correct URL?
Yeah, you can say, yeah, the remote URL could be incorrect or correct, yeah. And with a different rule. Yeah.
So we talked about, didn't we, the kind of level of abstraction. Something that is maybe important to talk about is that different rules happen at different levels of abstraction. And it's important to capture all the rules you've got, but some of them might not be ones that the business people care about. So this is one where you could sort of say that this rule that I'm wobbling about what makes it a correct remote is a sort of sub rule of how reconciliation loop is going to work. Does that make sense?
Well, we wouldn't enter the reconciliation loop if the remote was incorrect. So those are the two checks that happen on startup. First, is a directory with a Git repository, and is the remote correct? And then we enter the reconciliation loop, which has all of its own rules.
So is that example in the right place? Or do you see that as part of the...
Oh, no, I just stole that card.
Okay.
So all right. Okay, so we're putting these underneath. Okay, yeah, that's my bad. Right. So that example should have been under the other rule.
So this bit about this rule about what makes it a correct remote. So we've got this concept of it's not the correct repo.
And
we're going into we could go into from your little sticky there. We could go into what makes it correct repo, and whether to dive into that in example mapping is something where you sort of read the room. So if that's something only the devs are interested in,
so I think So I'm trying to understand what you said there. I think there's something really important there that hasn't been exposed yet. You're completely right about. Is that I have this knowledge in my head that says it is not the correct Git repository under this circumstance. And the circumstance is the code is hard coded to check for an origin, a remote called origin. And maybe that needs to be explicitly stickied somewhere. But,
so yeah, it's like, do you want that to be the reason you're writing these scenarios is to communicate with future people using the library.
Yeah.
So do you want that to be explicit in the gherkin?
Well, yeah, I think it should be, because if people want to use an existing remote that isn't provided or isn't cloned by the library, then they have to understand there's a rule that says that is possible if your remote is called origin.
Yeah, so we could come up with some examples quickly, right? And I'm just going to do notes. So because it's a workshop, we're just doing notes that are going to remind us later of what we talked about.
Okay.
You don't start writing out given, when, then in this. But you need enough detail that when you look at that note later, you'll have a good stab at writing out the detail, if that makes sense. So, Dan North has this thing. It's like the Friends episode names.
Yep.
So it's like the one where has origin, but wrong URL. That's enough to remind us later when we're reading this, right?
It is.
Has no origin.
Yep.
Remote.
Yep.
Someone might do that. What else? Has origin pointing to right URL. So it's okay. Can you think of another edge case? This is where testers are good, actually.
No, I think the rule is, I mean, it's a relatively simple rule. It's just good that we've documented it, and it's either right or wrong, and I think, or missing. Yeah, I think you've kind of documented the 3 existential states of a remote, so I'll go with it.
So Liscio has 2 strategies for finding more examples. I'll just talk about them here. One is context questions. So you look at an existing, this is when you've run out of ideas and you want to generate some more stuff. So you look at the context and you say, is there any context where it, can you see when I click on something? Yeah,
I can, yeah, it makes it kind of shadowed.
See that one? The directory exists, but isn't the Git repo. Don't claim it in error. Is there any situation where, so the context question is there any situation where there could be a directory that isn't the Git repo and we don't error?
No.
Okay. So you can ask questions like that, right? So this one, is there any situation where it would have the origin and the correct URL, but we wouldn't consider it the correct remote?
No, and maybe this again, is this something that's in my head that we have to get on a sticky somehow? Because the reason that the program will error and exit if it's not a Git repository or it hasn't got the correct remote is that this library is quite destructive, and that I mean, the way that it would proceed would be to remove that directory or start pulling the ref log over the top of it. And like, I never want to be in a situation where anyone, I can't say loses data, but if someone made a manual commit to that repository and then I come in and revert it and, reset and force pull or something like that, then I definitely put them in a situation where it's going to be a lot more work to get that back. Yeah. So the rule is always just in my head has been, well, if it's not what I expect and I can't proceed safely, exit.
Yeah.
Kind of where I am.
Yeah. Okay. And you should definitely capture that's what it's doing now, because we're trying to do this in a cheap way. I know we're talking through it because it's a stream, but we're just capturing what it's going to do now. Or if you're doing this at the start of your sprint, we're just going to capture what we're going to do next.
Yeah. Okay.
It's going to get committed to the code base maybe as feature files, but they're editable. So if it changes, if we change what it does, and actually we have some way of recovering from multiple directories, we'll change the features then when we get to it.
Yeah, I mean, someone could come along at some point, I guess, and add strict mode to this, which just says, well, I don't care what's on disk. This is what we need in this location, and we're always going to blow it away and make sure it's always the Git remote and no local changes. Like that could be a valuable feature eventually. So.
Yeah, and that's maybe a difference between the things that live in Jira, user stories or feature requests, right? Or other ticketing systems, and the thing that lives in your code base in the feature file. Because one is like a change, it's a set of changes, and the thing in your version control is like, this is actually what it does right now. You can read this to find out what it does right now because we're automating tests off it. So like, here's a truth about the system. If you're looking at looking through old Jira tickets, you can often find contradictory things, and you have to work out which was the latest, which one was latest, because that was the one that got, things get changed over time.
Well, I'm contradicting myself in a way because, like I said at the start, but I'm actually extracting internal code, private code that we have within our organization that I wrote to do this job, and I want to make it a reusable library for others. The one we use internally runs in that strict mode. It will do a reset and a clean on that directory before it does every reconciliation. But that's something that I'm personally willing for it to do, not something I'm willing to make, release open source, at least in the first version. So
yeah, you don't want the liability.
Exactly.
Right, so what else happens? So we're talking about cloning. What else happens in cloning? So Liz's other strategy. So we talked about context questions. Is there a context where this, examples have an action and an outcome?
Mm-hmm.
Is there a different context where that action wouldn't cause that outcome? That's the context question. And the outcome questioning is her other sort of line of approach that she talks about in a blog. As well as that happening, what else happens? So as well as erroring in these different cases, is there anything else that happens? Like, is there a log, or is there exiting is a, when we say error, maybe we should tighten that up. Where it says error, does that mean exit?
Yeah, so we print the standard error saying directory exists but isn't a Git repository, or directory exists as a Git repository but is an incorrect remote, and then we exit with a non-zero code. I don't know how much of that we'd capture in an example. So
I think about the audience.
I guess this is another thing that's tricky for me, is that I can understand the level users of a blog want to interact with it. This is a very developer-centric library. So I guess going into implementation details is the right level of abstraction, maybe, because developers want to know, all right, does it exit zero? Does it exit not zero? Like, maybe that is valuable information.
Yeah, and writing for the unknown audience is always harder. If you had a group of developers who are going to be using the library, and they're in this session with us, we'd naturally find that level of detail, because you can tell. You can tell when you've gone too deep, because no one cares. And the trick, if you're facilitating this kind of session, is to recognize that's happened and say, well, let's talk about that when we're building it, and you can write some unit tests, but we don't need to have that in the example map. It's not part of the. I think the thing is, you don't have anyone who's giving you acceptance criteria, right? There's no one you're doing both roles.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I have some internal voices that I try and listen to. They've all got different ideas for the features. I'll try not to pluralize that again, but this is something that, again, I built internally, and I'm just trying to extract. So you're right. Yeah. There's no users, there's no audience yet. I'm making a lot of assumptions.
But if you do have that kind of internal customer, internal stakeholder, product owner type person, you can tell when you've got to the point where they're like, yeah, I don't care about that, whatever you think, right? And that's the level you sort of cut off at. Because it gives you a lot more freedom of decision making as you build it. If right, just as an example, this first rule,
yep,
doesn't say anything about exiting or errors. So if we're in the conversation and I've got like if this is something we're going to sell, right, and we need to get someone to approve it, and we start, you and me, the devs, start talking about like, all right, so should it exit with a non-zero exit code? How much detail should we display the message? You would tell, someone would say, I don't care. All I care about is that it doesn't clone the repository. And that gives you a really useful heuristic that we're not going to need to capture all that stuff. That's something we can talk about when we're building it. And I can decide whether to implement that. And, you know, with my selfish developer hat on, if I run out of time, I can do a really basic version of it. And if I've got loads of time, I can have a really amazing thing where it like outputs it in a format that's got nice colors and, you know.
Yeah.
So I get a lot more flexibility about how it's implemented, and actually in an agile context, that makes it a lot easier to fit things into sprints. Because if you're running out of time, you do it. You know what the rule is for it to be acceptable to the business. So you can cut corners, or you can do a really great job if you think there's extra value to be had there for the users. You can do it even better than we talked about. But if you try and do it all in the conversation and you try and get all the detail, you're kind of locked into one specific implementation. Now, this isn't a UI-led project, but some stakeholders won't care what the page looks like, or they won't care what the interface looks like in the admin area, as long as it does the thing they want. They might trust the developers to do it. Other teams, they might want to see a wireframe.
Okay.
Again, you're discovering the level of detail in UX to go into. I try and stay away from UX stuff here because text isn't a good medium for doing user interface stuff. So example mapping, you try and capture all the business detail, and then maybe say, okay, we have to do some wireframes.
Okay.
So I run git sync, and it's going to clone the repo, and we've got these rules about whether it will clone the repo or not.
Yes, we do.
What else?
So, assuming that we pass the rules at that stage, we then enter the reconciliation where there are some more rules.
Yeah, let's move this in. So, do you want to call that a different feature?
I think reconciliation is a different feature. Yeah, I think there are two different stages of like if this was a state machine, there'd be the first stage, which is get prepare for reconciliation, and then there's reconciliation. So I think it is probably a new feature. So we've got our first feature, which is clone the repository. Now we're in the reconciliation loop feature. So I guess we can just change this to yellow.
So did we have an example? Yeah, go for it. If we had do we have an example that's we skip in the initial clone? Have we got one where it's there and it's got the right thing, so we just carry on?
No, we didn't.
So we do nothing and do reconciliation.
Now, would that reference the other row and just say directory as correct repo? So that means we can continue.
Yeah. Repo is already cloned, so don't need to clone.
Okay.
Repo is already cloned on disk, so we don't need to clone. Something that you don't really get in example mapping is a time series of steps. So you'd normally sort of have to overlay something else on that. You can use user story mapping. You can use event storming.
Okay.
If you've got a long running process that's a series of steps, there's no sort of arrow of time in an example map. It's an assumption that we want to understand the rules. But if it helps for you to have those rules in a context of time, there are other formats. There's also feature mapping, John Smart's feature mapping, which is a bit like example mapping, but it does have that arrow of time. So it's kind of halfway between this and event storming.
Okay.
So this is suitable where everyone kind of understands the steps. Imagine e-commerce, right? Everyone knows I put it in the basket and then I check it out.
Yep.
And you can talk about the things in isolation and say, well, what are the rules of what you can add to your basket? So tell me about reconciliation.
Okay, so once we enter the reconciliation phase, that just means that on a configured interval, we are going to attempt to fetch all updates to that repository.
We didn't talk about which branch we're looking at.
Yeah, it's part of the configuration, which I kind of omitted, I guess. So The library expects you to pass in a target, which is a branch or tag name, the repository URL, any authentication that's required. I mean, we can talk about what that config is. I don't know.
So does that affect this thing about it being the correct repo?
No, because the remotes would be configured regardless of target.
Yeah, okay. So as long as the origin's there.
As long as the origin matches the URL that we expect, then we will attempt to fetch on the target from the configuration.
Okay. So branches is going to be something we think about as part of reconciliation, maybe.
It will be for sure, definitely, and authentication, because so far, like to clone, well, I guess authentication is important for cloning, but if we have a directory exists and the remote is correct, then we don't need authentication at that stage, and it is the reconciliation that we do. Maybe that needs to be documented. I'm not sure, but maybe we should tackle some of the reconciliation first and then handle the auth. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm going to put that question there so we don't forget.
Yeah, sure.
By the way, it's perfectly fine to come out of example mapping with some unresolved questions. That's natural.
Yeah, I guess for today's example, we can just assume that the environment provides the authentication that we need, and we can bolt that on later, for sure.
Yeah, and just in life, you know, you're talking about it, and there's a question that we don't know the answer to. We have to go and ask someone. And if you're in a situation where you're deciding whether you're ready to start work on it, you can decide whether there's too many questions or not. If you see what I mean. If you've got something that's got loads of red questions on, you might say, well, let's not do it today. If you're doing like a Scrum thing, you might say it's not ready for sprint planning. If there's just if there's one question that seems minor, you can sort of say, oh, okay, well, we trust you to answer that.
I guess this is an exploratory thing into understanding the problem. Yeah, it's very visual to see all those red stickies and be like, oh, maybe we're not ready to, maybe we don't understand this enough yet, I guess.
Yeah, actually, if you zoom out a little bit, you can use the fit to width thing.
What's the fit to width thing? What's that?
In the bottom right, in the menu, in the map thing, the sort of arrows either side. Yeah. Fits the screen. You can you're right. You can sort of see from the shape what's going on. That first feature, what do you think jumps out?
I think it's quite nice. It's easy to see there are two sets of rules and multiple examples per rule. But I don't know if anything jumps out at me.
Yeah, I think there's maybe too many examples. It makes me think that rule could be decomposed into more than one rule, just from the shape.
Okay.
So we could, let's not do it now, but we could split it into a rule about the directory. Doesn't clone if the directory's not a Git directory. And we could have a separate rule that was like, it doesn't, also another rule is, it doesn't clone if there's a directory that's a Git repo that doesn't have the right remote. You know, we could split it into those two, and maybe that would be clearer for a reader. That's the only reason for splitting it.
Okay.
That's not the only reason for splitting it. The other reason for splitting it then is if you've identified there's two rules and you're in some kind of like prioritization, backlog, Scrum situation, i.e. you haven't done the work already like you have, you sometimes say, well, actually that thing where the directory exists and it's not a Git repo doesn't happen very much, so we can build that later. You know, you can, the rules tend to be the things that people care about being delivered in batches.
Yeah.
And this kind of vertical column thing is really useful for either deferring work or splitting things down.
Okay, that makes sense.
You know, what would happen if we didn't implement that rule about erroring with a nice message? Well, it'll just crash because it tries to do a clone and there's the thing already, and Git will do an error and it'll be an ugly error message. That's fine. We'll do the bit that catches that and like pre-checks and does a nice error message as part of sprint 4 instead of sprint 2. So yeah, let's go back to talking about reconciliation. So fetches all the updates to the repo on a configured interval. What's the happy version of that?
The happy version is that there are no local modifications, and it can do a fast forward pull or a fast forward fetch and merge, I guess, into the directory and publish the changes.
Publishes
And I mean that's a happy path. Should be 90+% of every run this does, right? You know, people are I would hope people using this library, and especially myself as a user of the library, I'm running it in an environment that wouldn't accept local modifications anyway. So, you know.
So I'm going to split this actually. It feels like there's two things we're talking about. Fetches happen on configured interval. Because it sounds like there's a concept there called a fetch.
There is, yes.
So where's it configured? How is it configured?
Via toml or command line argument.
Okay, so configured, and what happens? It's just running and fetching like a daemon.
Yeah. So I mean, I've tried not to mention this so far, but I keep conflating my examples here. Is that GetSync is exposed as a library and then a binary. So, you know, there's those two different modalities. But I'm going to try and stick to using it as a library and forget, because if we get the library right, the CLI is, the binary is fine. So you when you initialize a library, sorry.
That's very common, right? Most software is a stack of things, and if you write the examples, express the examples and the rules in the right way, they apply to both situations. So if you can phrase them, if for a website, if you pretend that some people are on mobile and some people are on the web and some people are talking to it through Alexa, you can get to the point where you're phrasing it in a way where the business detail's there, the detail that's relevant to the rule is there, but all that other stuff isn't.
Yeah, so if we just say configured with an interval of 5 seconds, then that just means every 5 seconds the reconciliation loop is going to run. It's going to fetch the remote and try to do a fast forward merge with the changes. I guess the simplest example actually would be it runs and the remote says there are no more updates. So it doesn't do anything. That's it.
Let's just talk about configured fetches as one thing, right?
Yeah.
And then it fetches all updates to the repo. What's the example you just gave? No remote, no local or remote mods.
Okay. Yeah.
Nothing happens. So this is when a fetch happens, right?
Correct.
So if there's no local mods, it does a fast forward.
Well, if there's no local mods, it will attempt a fetch. So, I mean, if there are local mods, it won't even attempt a fetch.
What will it do?
It will return an error and the reconciliation loop will exit. Because we don't want to blow away people's local changes.
Okay, so I think that sounds like a new rule, right?
Exit the
loop if... I think the number of examples you're giving is a good sort of guide to that.
Okay. So if there are local modifications, then we just say, look, you've done something we don't expect, and we're not going to blow it away. So, you know, good luck. Go fix it. And it's up to the user to go and either commit or revert those changes.
And the thing we're talking about in terms of prioritization, right? You could decide not to do that yet. You could say, we'll just write it in the manual. Don't do that. And they'll get undefined behavior if they've made some local mods.
Yep.
So, you know, and the way you sort of do that is you'd sort of say, well, okay, this is a different feature. We're not building that this sprint. We'll call it, you know, you'd put another yellow sticky there and say, we'll call this local mod production feature, and we'll have a separate Jira ticket for it, and, you know, all that jazz.
Okay.
If you do all that stuff. Or a different pull request.
Yes.
So you could implement the fetches happening on a configured interval, right? You could just, when you're implementing it, you can just say, well, I'm going to do this configuration thing, and I'll just make sure it calls some function every 5 seconds if that's what's in the config file.
Yep.
And I'll commit that and push it because it doesn't hurt anyone. And then, you know, then you do the actual fetches. So no local remote mods, nothing happens. no local mods does a fast forward pull.
Yep.
Are there any other? Is there any situation where you'd have no local mods, and it would do a merge or something else?
Yeah. So I said fast forward very explicitly because there are, I guess, two other conditions. It could be that when we fetch the remote, that history has been rewritten, and we are not actually able to do the fast forward merge, and we would error in that case too. At least for now. I mean, I think there may be features in the future where we try and handle that better. But for now, GitSync really, because the simplest path is just to expect a linear history in Git. Like, this is supposed to be an automated system. We don't expect people to rewrite the history, at least initially.
And I guess there could be like the branch was deleted.
It could be someone did a rebase, someone modified a commit message. It could be, I mean, there are many examples of what would break fast forward merge.
Right. So, and you're not going to clobber the local if the remote's changed.
Yeah, I would want to error and say, hey, the history here has changed. We expect you to go and blow away that directory and we'll clone it from scratch. We may provide a flag that does that automatically, but again, I'm trying to do this the safest way first and then add on overrides.
Yeah. That's a good example of like, you might do something different in future and you'll come back and take this example out.
Yeah, exactly.
So what else? Are there any other situations? Let me look at them. So when there's no local remote mods, nothing happens. Nothing at all happens.
Correct.
Nothing else happens.
Yep, it goes back to sleep till the configured interval and then loops.
And we're always going to try to do a fast forward pull.
It will only accept a fast forward fetch and merge, yes. So that's a pull would be a fetch and merge. So I mean, there are things that happen when there are those changes. Maybe we need to bring in those. I don't know if that's a different feature or not. I'll trust your judgment. But say there are 4 commits to that branch. I guess that's unlikely depending on the interval. But say there are 4 commits. It will then work out the diffs of those commits, look for all the files that have changed, and it publishes a message that says, hey, these files have changed to any number of subscribers.
Okay, so does that sound like maybe that? Well, I think what I would tend to do is have that as a rule here. And if the feature's looking wide, I'd think, well, are some of these things a different thing?
Okay.
So what pull reports?
So yeah. Pull reports. I mean, I don't know if I'd use that vocabulary. I don't know if that's important, but
it is important. What would you call it?
Go
on, you type it.
I thought I just got to watch. Right. Okay. So, changes to repo are published on file level. So it's not patch level. We only inform you that a file has changed, not which lines, not which blobs. None of that is important. The idea being that whoever signs up for subscriptions can say, I want to be notified of changes within this directory. And this is future work. I'm not going to get into it too much, but you can say as a consumer of this library, here's my subscriber. It wants to know all YAML files in this directory change. But the first one is just, hey, here's all the files that changed.
So is that right? If I pull 4 commits to foo.txt, I get 1 notification that foo.txt changed.
Correct. Yes.
And if I pull 1 commit to foo.txt, and I'll do YAML actually, because if that's more like your use case, it's good to match use cases.
Yep.
2 notifications. I get 1 notification with both files, or I get 2 notifications?
That's a good point. So right now you get 1 notification that has multiple objects in it. So it would be a list of files that had changed.
Yeah.
So 1 notifications with both files.
So what if I put a file name in there? Just is it to
the file name is what will be listed in the change set.
Yeah. So as long as that's understandable to everyone. So if nothing's pulled, do you get a notification that nothing changed, or do you get no notification?
there would be no notification. Nothing would happen.
So, whether this is a different feature, we've talked about that a few times already, but it just depends on whether you feel like you're going to do it all in one go, or whether that's going to be something you might do separately. Which is a sizing thing. It's that feature size thing, right? If you're a team who are trying to get everything down to a day, maybe you'd use that as a nice seam along which to split your feature.
I mean, I think I would. I mean, I'm already thinking about this from a code point of view. And I think, I really want to make sure the reconciliation loop is solid and tested. And that just means I probably would have notifications or pops up as a new feature afterwards when I'm happy with the reconciliation. So yeah, let's move over.
Even within the features, I would tend to work on these rule by rule sometimes as a way of organizing my workflow. So that's probably enough to talk about for now as an example of how to do it.
Sweet.
How long's that? 50 minutes?
An hour and 10.
Yeah, but we chatted for a bit at the start.
Oh, we did. I thought you meant in total. All right.
My energy is dropping. Yours might be as well. And that's why I sort of say half an hour. It would be better if we talked about this first bit one morning, and then the next day over the lunch we come back to it and say, what else should happen.
Yeah, sure. So, and the next, if you've got a couple more minutes, so I'll make this board.
I'm saying that's enough.
Can I just make this public to the world? Yeah, I can. Okay, cool. So
I'm going to go and split that first rule.
Okay, so in the show notes, I'll put a link to this board if anyone wants to follow along at home. I'm curious then, before we finish up, is like, I want to start getting this library moving forward, right? And this has been really good. I've taken a lot of the knowledge that I had in my head about how I want it to work, and we've now got that with rules. What is my next step then as a developer? Do I start writing scenarios and feature files that map to these features? Like, is each one of these yellow post-its one feature, and then a rule is a scenario? Is that a fair mapping of what I do next?
Yeah.
Yes.
So very specifically, these map to Gherkin syntax. And what we could do, what time do you want to finish? 5:30?
Yeah, roughly.
Later.
I'm flexible, whatever you've got, mate.
So let's write some of it out as Gherkin. I'm just editing though at the moment, which is a bad thing to do. Just to separate out that big one. If the directory refactoring is important. So we have the happy version. No on disk, so clone the remote.
Correct.
If the directory exists and isn't a git clone, error. Not clone, checkout. Checkout. If the directory is git, but doesn't match the remote, don't clone. And I think I think all of these are examples of that rule. I think this is the same rule.
Okay.
It's just the definition of what correct is. So does that make sense? I'm going to get rid of that.
Yeah, makes sense.
So these are all explicitly error versions.
Yep.
It's often good to run through at the end of example mapping, do a bit of this. And it is a bit easier. It's a bit easier in person because people are willing to move stickies around. And it's easier if you're in this kind of session and there's loads of people familiar with it. I think the first time you do it, you end up with one person being the sort of owner of the board. I think I've done that a bit today, and he's the only one typing. So if you can try and break that down a bit, if you're doing this in groups, that could be productive. You know, while Dave and I were talking about the other stuff, someone could have been coming back and clarifying this to their own sort of satisfaction, and then calling you back. So so that's probably enough output. Which feature do you want to quickly do in Gherkin?
Oh, I feel like the initial clone feature will be the simpler one.
So are you able to do some sort of split screen with the IDE?
Yeah, sure.
Oh yeah, you're a Mac user now.
I am.
You've joined us.
Oh, I'm trying to be. All right, so there we go.
So delete that example.
Delete.
Wow.
That's my life's work.
Undelete it. Let's look at it. It looks like a rule to me. Oh no, maybe not. Maybe that's an example.
What I wrote was, I think I tried to encapsulate everything in a single example, as if I was trying to write like one end-to-end test, which I don't think was necessarily the correct approach. And then I did, this is a rule. I think I got a little bit confused. This is, if there's nothing there, then this is what I expect to happen. And then I was going to try and layer on the edge cases after that. So let's just comment that. Will we just start from what we've mapped?
Feature.
So this would just match this, right? So initial clone of the repository, right?
So you're expanding on stuff because it's just scrappy notes from your conversation. Generally, one or maybe two people would go away and write it up. And who does that? I like Matt Wynn's heuristic, which is whoever learnt the most. So what we're going to do is we're going to write this down, and then we're going to everyone who's in the meeting's here, but we then share it back and say this is what we talked about. And if you do that on short enough time scale, like hours or days, it's really easy for the people who were in the conversation to read through it and just go, yep, right? Because it's already loaded into their head.
Okay.
If you write it all down and then 6 months later show it to someone, they won't know what any of it means sometimes, or they won't be able to say, yes, that's what we talked about. So it's important to have that feedback loop. Whoever feels like they learned the most, so maybe that would be me, would then write out the examples with more detail, expanding on it a bit, show it to the people who had the more knowledge at the start. And if they say, yep, that's right, that's an important validation step that I understood it, because I was able to sort of talk it back to you. I do that with my daughter. If I tell her, if there's some important instruction, I ask her to say it back to me, like to make sure she went in. So you've got feature. You can now have what's called a feature narrative. You can have like a paragraph or more of stuff.
Right
here? The parser just looks for the word. The next line, yeah. Anything that doesn't have the word example with a colon is going to be fine there. The parser will just seek to the next keyword. So that's a good place to put some.
So would you call it, if we wanted to name this, it's like bootstrap get repository, like maybe give it a catchier name and then use a narrative to actually explain what that means?
When we first run, we need to check blah 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 blah. You can put your as a so that we need to be able to.
So
if you've got that, don't create it if you haven't got it. And you can put random other things that people talked about. This is for Barry in the accounting. It's just for some free text that's going to be useful to a reader.
Right, okay.
There's lots of places you can put free text in a feature file, specifically because we're expecting them to be read by people as well as parsed by robots.
So like short and sweet like that for now.
Yeah. And now, which cucumber are you using? Do you know?
the new syntax stuff that we talked about a few weeks ago when I was curious, it works. Like so.
So Gherkin 6 was the first one that added a new keyword for ages.
Gherkin what? Sorry.
Gherkin version 6.
Okay.
Cucumber 6 was the first one that had a Gherkin change for a while. So you can put rule in, because we've been doing example mapping a lot. You can put a rule. So what's the first rule?
Local directory doesn't exist.
Yeah, you can phrase it as a rule though. What you can put it on sticky, you know.
So repositories are cloned if not already. So we have in the blue, right?
Already on disk. You're improving it from the workshop. You're making it into sentences.
Oh, right.
Not already.
Okay.
And you know, this is potentially going to be mapping on to some code.
Okay. Now, should I put in new lines, or it's all fit on a line? Does that matter?
All goes on the line. It's a good incentive to keep it short.
Okay, so I got a comment saying I am difficult to understand. Stuffy nose. Yeah, I do have allergies, and they're quite bad today. Sorry about that. Plus, I'm Scottish, which means I'm not really natively speaking English anyway. But I'll try and improve. So thanks.
I don't know if Gherkin supports Scots yet. It might do. You can contribute translations in the main Gherkin repository. So there's a little language thing you can put at the top of the file, and it switches all the keywords into something else. So underneath the rule, you can have another paragraph if it's a really complicated rule and you want to sort of explain the reasons behind it, but let's not bother. And then you indent. We've got one example, haven't we?
We do have an example. So we would say no local. I keep trying to type this in title case. I don't know why I have this fixation with using title case. I need to try and get over that.
Because it's the happy path, we could either not give the example a title, because it seems a bit like the thing, or you don't have examples don't have to be in a rule. So sometimes for short feature, I'd have the example just under the feature, but underneath the example, we have these steps. So given, when, then.
Okay, so given I have no local directory, when I do the thing, I don't know.
When I sync the Git, when I do Git.
When I sync the Git, then I have a locally cloned version. I mean, I always really suck at this given, when, then stuff. So
that's okay. So the important thing
what
is
did I write up here? So given I have git sync configured, so we're not talking about configuration right now, and a local directory does not exist. So I have no local directory yet. When I sync a git repository, when I sync a git repository, then the repository is cloned. Essentially, I think my language there was probably better. Yeah, is that great?
So, yeah, so there are some things we could talk about here. So how much detail do you want to include? We could include the URL of the Git repository, and it really doesn't matter in terms of automation, and it really doesn't matter in terms of business agreement. It's purely, is it going to add value for the reader to understand that rule? That's the important thing to do if you're using rules. Does it help understand that rule? Would a reasonable person understand that it's the same URL, it's the same repository that's going to be cloned?
So would we provide a table here with example configurations, like what the target directory, like we don't say what the local directory is. Does that mean that gitsync always clones to a hard-coded location? Is it something that's passed in through configuration, which means we have to make it very explicit in this example? Does that matter yet?
Good questions. It depends.
I knew you were going to say that.
Yeah. It's about the target audience. So would if you think about who's going to be reading it, are they going to assume that the Git repository I asked to be synced is the one that's cloned to disk?
So what I have in my head is we haven't in our example mapping spoken about configuration. Now, it may be that the first version of this I released doesn't actually allow you to configure it, and it probably is a hard-coded location, and then this scenario doesn't care. And it may be that I come back later and add a new feature that allows them to configure how that bit works, and then those features and those rules and those examples will have something that says, here's how it's configured, and that's how it works. I mean, is that fair? Okay.
Yeah. When you're on a greenfields project, most of the time you're writing new feature files. As it grows, you start to be editing the feature files more often. So you might come back and edit this feature and say, actually, there's another rule, which is we can clone to a place that isn't the default if it's configured. Well, that could be like you add extra examples for if a different location is given. It could be you do that in a different file. It's kind of optional. That management is really, it's about how you think of these things inside the business.
Okay. So I don't think it matters then, and this feature failed, this rule in this example, because we haven't explored the configuration element yet, right? So.
Yeah, and I think so we could add in, when I sync the repository at git colon whatever, then git colon whatever is cloned to disk. But I don't think a reasonable reader would expect anything different. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
I think anyone would think you're going to implement it. So I asked to sync some remote, and you sync some different Git repo. So I think that's enough. That's maybe enough detail, but it's definitely a judgment call for the author. So what's the next rule?
Well, we have a question, if you want to tackle that, from James. Is example synonymous with scenario? He's always used scenario. Is there a case where one would use scenario versus example?
Example is just more understandable to most people. They're actually implemented as synonyms in the parser translation. So implementing it was quite easy. They just added in English, it can be scenario or example. It's exactly the same thing, but just experience of talking to normal people. I was working with someone recently who's got a sort of languages background, and she was referring to them as scenarii.
Scenarii.
Yeah, which I think is good, but it sort of shows it's not really plain language. So they are the same thing.
Okay, great. That's good to
know.
It's
a lot easier to say, give me an example of how that would be applied, than it is to say, what scenario? I think scenario is more for people into tabletop war games like I used to be.
Yeah, I think example makes more sense to me. But feature rules and examples, I think they apply better to me than what the previous syntax did. So.
Yeah, and rule has been retrofitted in because it was so useful to talk about. Talking about these things in the context of a business rule is really useful.
Yeah, agreed.
I've heard of a big company in the US, who are using this as a way of finding out what their business rules are. So they kind of grep their feature files and they discover which business rules are implemented in their system.
Interesting. All right. So we have our first rule documented, our first example provided. Now, I'm assuming, again, developer head on here, right? Would I go through each of the example mapping stickies, all the different rules, and put them into a feature file? Or at this stage, would you go and start writing a test for your first rule and example? Or does that not matter? Am I just overthinking that?
At this stage, just after example mapping, I would write them all out, not worry too much about it being Gherkin syntax, and share them. So if you're using a ticketing system, maybe you put them in there. Maybe you paste them into Slack and get a thumbs up. I'd do that validation of the things we covered in the workshop. Then it's like, when are you going to work on this feature? It's in your backlog, and You know,
Yeah.
today I'm going to work on the initial clone. I would then put that feature into the code base as part of my commit. Now you can use tagging. So I'd probably copy paste it all out of wherever I got the feedback and get it all into Git here. But then you can tag things as excluded. So all cucumbers have a sort of tagging system. So I would probably put, how many examples have we got? 1, 2, 3, 4, 3 rules and 5 examples. I'd probably dump them all onto disk as the first thing I did. And then maybe I'd put an at, I don't know, not implemented yet on the ones I haven't done yet. Except everything except the first one I'm going to tackle. And then when I run Cucumber, I'd run it with, yeah, something like that. You can run it with, don't run the ones that aren't implemented yet. Get one of the scenarios passing. So the tag can apply on the example or on the rule or on the feature. If that makes sense.
It does make sense, yeah. I mean, I think when I was, I've already written some CRUD testing for my previous one. So I think for now, what I'll do is I will type up all of the example mapping stuff into feature files, not implement it, and just push that to the repository, and then continue from there. Sorry?
I tend to do it as part of the same PR. You can do it as a different commit if you want to, but
what do you mean, the test or the admin? Because you told me to commit all the feature files to disk first. So in my head, I'm like, okay, I should just go through the example map, write all the feature files with the rules and examples that we have, push that up. I don't have a team. That's just an open source thing that I'm working on. But in theory, by it being there on the GitLab repository, other people can see. And then I would go back and start to add the actual test cases and the functionality at the same time, right? No.
Yeah, you can do that. I think I'm more used to sort of inside a company, you'd be doing that sharing and getting feedback outside of Git. I guess GitOps, you'd be doing it inside Git, right?
Well, I guess, if anyone wants to write some Rust code and finds this domain interesting, then even just by me getting these feature files and pushing them to Git, I can say to anyone watching, hey, if you want to learn Rust, this might be a good opportunity for you to come and write code that would help me. So,
yeah, sure. That's definitely true. And there are tools that sort of help that. So, oh God, I can never remember the names of them. So Q has one called, I really should know. So the Cucumber have a tool that will connect to your Git repo and expose the feature files in a nice, explorable, commentable, editable interface that's sort of friendly for people who aren't really into Git. And there are other similar tools. So there's definitely a sort of level of collaboration that happens.
I think for this particular domain, people that are not interested in Git probably don't care about this project. But you're right, for sure. We also got another... Sorry, Andy, go for it.
It'd be interesting to look at maybe some way of publishing the not implemented ones in a specific location.
Yeah.
Open an issue for each one.
Yeah, I should do that, actually, shouldn't I? We also got another comment from James, which I just color up your face while we're at it. But his favorite thing about Gherkin is just the documentation side of it and not so much the testing. And, I don't know if I'm right or wrong, but you're back. I don't know if I'm right or wrong, but I mean, BDD, they always say it's not about testing, right? It is about the human aspect of it rather than the automation side of it. So.
Yeah, and depending when you're having these sort of example mapping conversations, you might discover a business rule and then not implement it in the software. It might be something that people using the admin system do, right? So a rule is you can't mark an invoice as paid if it is less than £1,000 without more than £1,000 without approval from a supervisor. We might uncover that in example mapping. And then when we're looking at the practicality of when we're going to build this stuff, we'll just say, okay, we'll write that on an email to everyone. Don't approve an invoice.
Yeah.
But maybe you want to document that as part of your your documented features and tag it with like @offline policy. It's just good to know what the rules are sometimes, and then it gives you an opportunity in the future. Maybe you can automate it.
Yeah, I think that's definitely the same vibe I had when I started when I wanted to write the feature files for this, was really just to expose the rules of what happens with the library when you use it. I mean, the test, yeah, that would be useful, but really it was just about documenting, hey, if you use this and a directory exists, the best way to find that out, what happens or what the conditions are for it to continue operating successfully, is just to read the feature files. You know, this for me is very much the documentation on how this slightly esoteric library is going to work, more than the tests. Although I do want tests, but still.
Yeah, so let's talk about that tests, right? So just looking at this feature, you could do that in 3 commits, right? You could implement cloning assuming the directory is never going to be there.
Yep.
Write a test where the directory is not there, and sort of implement that first rule, and call it a day. Go home for the day. If you've got some time, you can make the next one, choose one of the others. If the directory exists but isn't a git checkout, you add a guard, and then implement the third one, which involves more git. But as you're working through that, each business rule, we mentioned earlier, each software project is a stack of different layers, and where you choose to test really affects how the architecture is going to look, because the level you choose to validate something at, you're sort of constraining that the rule has to be implemented below that in the stack, if you want to look at it that way. So you've got your sort of core, you've got your user interfacey stuff, which in your case is a binary or it's library calls. And underneath you've got infrastructure, you've got Git, which I guess you might have some interfaces around. Some abstractions around.
Yeah.
And by narrowing down what part of the system you're testing, you're actually testing the rule. You're constraining where the rule is. So if I let's take this first. Let's take the if the directory exists thing. If you choose to test that through the CLI, and the way you would choose these different testing strategies is you'd tag it. So you'd have one set of Cucumber tests, so one set of Cucumber steps, like you've got that are running the CLI, but then they're filtering on the ones that are tagged at CLI or something like that.
Yep.
And then you have another Cucumber world, I don't know what it's called in the Rust version, that's different implementations. It's testing it by calling the library with a different tag, and you run different sort of filter sets, right? If you test it through the CLI,
just thought I'd check if it actually set it up properly. I'll come back to it. Sorry, when you go.
So this rule, if the directory exists and isn't a git checkout error, where do we want that to be implemented? If we test through the CLI, it can be implemented in the CLI command, whatever it is.
Yep.
Or it can be implemented in the library, or it can be implemented in Git. So it could be implemented by Git throwing an error, and we're just catching it later. So we don't know where the check is. That might be fine, depending on the project. Like, as long as it's in there somewhere, it's fine. If you want to ensure that it's in the library, then you should automate that test at the library level. Same scenario, but you automate it at that library level, and then you know it's not implemented in the CLI. If it's a web app, you check it by calling some service, and then you know it's not implemented in the controller or the template or the JavaScript. Maybe you want it in the JavaScript, so you implement it in the JavaScript Cucumber that doesn't have a real backend.
Yeah.
But you're choosing for your test strategy where you want the rule to be implemented in future as well. Now, at the other end, you've got the infrastructure. So how do you stop things being implemented by a database trigger, or stop things being implemented by just Git already has that behavior? You have some abstraction, and you would replace Git with a fake in your tests, right? if you want to constrain it to just being implemented in that middle bit, which is more of a decoupled architecture. But the testing strategy helps you design that architecture. I'm writing an abstract for a talk like this now. That's good. You see what I mean? On some projects, you might be super happy. You test the whole stack, and I test it by calling the binary, and as long as it's in there, it's fine. Your thing, because you want it to be a library, you should primarily be testing at the library level, and then testing a subset at the CLI level, just like as smoke tests.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense to me, for sure. So why don't...
and do you want it to be independent of Git?
No.
So you probably leave Git in there. Unless there's a speed problem.
It's tied pretty heavily to libgit too. I mean, obviously, we could say there's an abstraction where it should be able to support other version control systems, but I think with the ubiquity of Git, it's just not something, at least in any short to medium-term goals of the project, for sure.
Yeah, so in that case, you wouldn't bother testing with a fake Git if Git's fast enough. If you find your tests are going really slow because it's doing real Git, you might do it. But that kind of like architecture test strategy, you wouldn't deliberately replace Git. And it means that your business rule about the directory exists might be implemented by Git, by libgit.
Yeah.
I mean, the CLI Git does throw an error if the thing already exists. So maybe you can just catch that exception from libgit or catch that error. Yeah. And you don't care where in that stack it's implemented. So each of these things, you just think about what level to test that to make sure the rules there. That's one of the key things about rules is they're actually implemented somewhere. Examples aren't implemented anywhere. But rules have a kind of specific location if they're fine-grained enough. They're in a library, or they're in a service, or they're in a UI component.
Okay. So let me see if I can recap this then. So we were using our example mapping technique, and let me see if I can just stop splitting this screen actually, and then go back to here. And we managed to, I think, quite well go through a large chunk of this library, right? You know, we've got various features here. We're cloning a repository, call that bootstrap, whatever I want. I'll maybe give that a slightly snappier name as a phase. We've got the rules here, and we've got examples. And just as our back and forward, as we were going through that, I think we began to share knowledge and understanding of what this library was supposed to do, which I think is super invaluable. As far as the other features go, we talked about the reconciliation and what the semantics are there. I think what's good is documenting the knowledge and understanding we have of how that works now is really important, but also it provides a framework for extension. Like now other developers can come in and go, oh, maybe we don't want to error when this fast forward isn't possible, and then they can drop in new bits of functionality. They have new stickies, which helps them build out new feature files, new gherkin, and then expand that library. I love this as a framework, not for just documenting and testing, but just allowing people to expand the functionality as well. And then we talk about something that is really, really undefined at the moment, which is, well, how do we expose this as a pub subsystem for people to then build their own tooling on top of this with whatever integrations they want? And I think this document is really cool for doing that. And then we started to map that directly almost from feature rules and examples right into our gherkin. But I will get some test cases put up and push this to the repository. But then we have a full thing from stickies to human documentation to computer documentation, which is the test. I really like that. Now, is this something that you think we can come back and carry on in the future when I've done a little bit of homework or hooked up a few of these components? Is that something you would like to do?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'm not going to be able to help you with the Rust particularly. But,
well, maybe I could teach you some Rust at the same time as well. So.
Yeah. But generally, I wouldn't... Once you've written out the scenarios before you put them in version control, we tend not to keep the example maps around because they tend to lose meaning quite quickly because of the lack of details. Right now, they mean a lot to you and me and maybe the people watching. But if we come back to them later, we might not remember what any of it means.
So that visual representation's not too important then? Like, I mean, what I'm thinking for is like the more feature files we put together is good if you want to understand an individual feature, but is there not a way to understand the system as a whole? Just like, say you were onboarding a new developer, like just to give them that really 10,000 feet overview.
Maybe that'd be useful to generate this. If people are really familiar with this kind of visualization, it'd be interesting to generate it from feature files. And I wonder if anyone's doing that.
Yeah,
but there's less detail in this than there will be in the Gherkin. Because it's it's just like, remember to write an example about this. So normally, I mean, if it's stickies on a wall, you know how that goes. That doesn't stay too long; they fall off.
Oh yeah, definitely. But I can always take a photo of it and upload it to Confluence, right? That's what all professional teams do. So.
Yeah, that'll work.
Well, I think what I'll do is in the show notes, I will include the example mapping for anyone that's watching, you know, in the future and just wants to see what that looked like. Although I guess the video's there too, but still, you know, I'll leave it up online. But I'll try not to refer to it too much on my own and use the feature files. And I'll definitely do some Googling to see if anyone has wrote any tooling to generate maps from feature files. I think that would be pretty sweet, actually. All right.
Yeah, I know there are some online example mapping tools. We're not using a specific one because I wanted to just make it simple. But yeah, maybe some of them work in reverse. And yeah, let's follow up. Be good.
All right. Well, thank you again for donating even more of your time and teaching me all of your magic. It's been very useful. What I'll do is I will try and, well, I'll definitely get all the feature files written for what we've example mapped. I'll start to hook that up to Cucumber Rust, which is a library, hopefully get the features working. And then what we'll do is I'll chase up with you in maybe a week, 2 weeks time. We'll try and get something else scheduled. I don't know if it'll be December or if we'll be heading next year. We can work that out later. But we'll try and follow up and show people how far along we're getting with this and hopefully provide more, or at least get more knowledge out of your brain and share it with people, because I think it's fantastic. So.
Great. And, you know, I do this for a living, so if anyone wants to.
Yeah. If your team is looking for help in this domain, then maybe it's best just to, you know, grab you on Twitter, grab you on any of the socials, whatever. James says, thank you. No, thanks for sticking with us. We hope that was useful. So, Kieran, I'll let you get back to your day. Thank you again, and I'll speak to you soon.
Bye.